Hello everyone, welcome to our online class, mass media or electronic media, and we are in class 7 and the topic is radio and the birth of broadcasting. And I'm Professor Eccles and we are online and ready to roll. So we're going to get as close an approximation of my PowerPoint slide presentations and of course my narration, my voiceover, my discussion that you would normally get in a classroom, and let's see how close we can approximate all that. I will also have from week to week links of YouTube videos and documentaries and things like that that I would normally be showing you in class from my own DVD collection. So after, or perhaps when I'm talking about that subject today, we're going to cover radio, and in the early days of radio there was the very famous or infamous broadcast of War of the Worlds. And so when we get to that discussion of War of the Worlds on the slides, you might pause the video and watch, go to the link and watch the really good documentary on YouTube of the War of the Worlds. 1900s, 120 years ago, inventors were putting together tubes and things like that, and we have an ongoing theme, which is that inventors don't always know what is going to happen to their inventions. And our example here is the inventors of radio or wireless broadcasting. They were thinking that because the Titanic sank in 1912 and there were lots of ships at sea even a little bit before that, that it would be a good way to communicate with ship to shore. Of course, we know that it didn't turn out that way, and lots of other inventions like television, and especially like computers and recording, phonograph, all that stuff, they all went in kind of a different direction than the inventors thought they were going to go in. So no, it didn't end up being primarily for ship to shore, and this is I assume it's a recreation of the room at the Titanic, the telegraph room at the Titanic, and some wireless for radio communications. So there is a government agency, as so often is the case, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and they are the agency that oversees over-the-air broadcasting. Okay, there they are, and they're still early on. It was under different names and things, but they have ended up. I think it was the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission, at one point, and so on. But basically, it's been the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, for quite a long time, and they still oversee over-the-air broadcasting. And I know that most broadcasting is not always over the air. It might be streamed. It might be bouncing off satellites and all that. But it's all about over the air. And the reason for that is spectrum scarcity. That's what gives the FCC and the government the right. Is the spectrum is limited. And unlike newspapers, I mean, there aren't an unlimited amount of trees to make paper, of course, in the old days. But the spectrum was, there was only a certain point or a certain part of the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, that would allow radio broadcasting. Here is a nice display that I saw at a museum here in Southern California, Natural History Museum up in LA. And here we see where radio, but it's also microwaves and infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, and so on. Here's the other side of here's the other side of that, all the way up to X-rays. And radio is just kind of a limited part of all that. So electromagnetic spectrum, pretty much, everything, radio, color, pulsars, all sorts of good stuff is part of that amazing electromagnetic spectrum. I won't pretend to go through the physics of it, but radio is part of a limited area, and that's what gives the government the right to, or at least according to the courts, it gives the government the right to restrict it and have an agency to oversee it. I don't want to do too much of this, of the technology of all this, but it's important to know we have 214 markets in the U.S. That's what they're called, markets. So we'll round it to about 200 or so if I ever asked that sort of a question on a test. There's about 200 markets in the U.S. And a market is how far this broadcast signal can reach. And since the Earth is curved, then signals end up just going off into space at a certain point, right? At a certain point, they're just going to go off in space. If you're way over here on the far enough around the Earth, then it's going to go off. Don't worry about all these numbers and 7 miles and radio horizons and all that kind of stuff. But just know that San Diego is in a different market, and Las Vegas is in a different market, and Palm Springs is in a different market, and Santa Barbara is in a different market because they're too far away. After 100 or so miles, you could pick up those signals from Los Angeles, but you'd have to put up a really tall antennas, right, on real high mountains and go way up there. But for most people, in their homes and driving around in their cars, they're not going to be able to pick up those signals. So it's in a different market. And that's kind of convenient because a lot of what radio is going to be for people is it's going to be local news, local traffic, weather, all that kind of stuff. And for, just as the name says, markets for selling, right? So people wanting to advertise a car dealership or a restaurant or something like that, if they're 100 miles away, they're not going to care that much about that market that's so far away. So it works out physically, but it also works out as a business that markets are in a limited area. And whether we're in the San Gabriel Valley or Orange County or any of that, we are all in the Los Angeles market, and it goes all the way up to, Simi Valley, way on the other end of the San Fernando Valley, out to San Gabriel Valley, down the coast to, maybe Dana Point is probably the far end of it on the coast. And we're in the second biggest market. So in the 1920s, the first networks formed. And the very first one was created by RCA, the Radio Corporation of America. That gives you a little bit of a clue as to what they were formed to do. And they were formed to sell radios, and they were big enough that they could have two radio networks, NBC Red, National Broadcasting Company, and NBC Blue, National Broadcasting Company. So they had two radio networks, and they formed the radio networks to sell their radios. It seems a little bit backwards, but that's kind of what happened with computing, IBM and so on, and then along comes the internet. Computers came before the internet, and so on. So they formed a network so that people would have something to do with the radios that they were expecting to sell them, all the RCA radios, and later on they got into music and records and all of that. And this gentleman here is David Sarnoff, and he is the head of RCA, really one of the first of our media moguls. We will meet more media moguls, and about some like Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg. They're media moguls. What Jobs was a media mogul. So David Sarnoff, way back, the head of RCA, which is the parent company of NBC. The head of the third radio network after the two NBC networks, NBC Red and NBC Blue, was William S. Paley, and he was the head of CBS, the third radio network. They were family owned. It wasn't as big a corporation as RCA, but they ran a pretty good network, and they did lots of amazing things. They weren't overshadowed exactly by the bigness of NBC Red and Blue. And so that is William S. Paley, and he and his family ran it into the, I think, the 1980s or so, from the 20s to the 80s. He and his family ran it. It might have been the late 70s, but Paley and his family ran it. So the way radio is set up, the business of radio is that the networks were formed to offer programming so that people would have a reason to buy a radio, really, in essence. And they were only allowed to own so many stations in the country. The FCC said you can only own so many, 6 or 8 or 10 or something like that. So they owned radio stations, and then later, this is gonna happen to television too. They owned radio stations, New York, LA, Chicago, the big cities of that time, the 20s and 30s. And since they weren't allowed to buy many more than that, they offered affiliations to the network so that they could have this top talent, right? The big singers, the big entertainers, the big comedians from New York City and Los Angeles, and they could go out all over the country. So, you know, if you're running a small radio station in the middle of Michigan or Iowa or something like that, you're not going to have big, famous singers and comedians and acts and that sort of thing. But if you are affiliated with a network, then you can get all sorts of wonderful programming. So there are affiliates, and then the network is allowed to own and operate a limited amount, and it's limited by the FCC, and that changes from administration to administration. The FCC is, it's political, right? The members are appointed by the president. So, you know, if one president gets in from one political party that want less oversight and regulation, or if the members would be appointed by a different political party that think that regulation and oversight is a good thing. So it is political, and the pendulum does swing like it does in so many other parts of our country, and especially in business, back and forth. 1945, the courts ruled that NBC had a monopoly. They had to sell off one of the networks. NBC Blue becomes ABC, and this is kind of around the transition time of radio, very slowly. The war's not quite over yet. World War II is not quite over yet. Television isn't quite ready yet, but the radio networks are going to more or less transition into becoming television networks. And here we have a nice young disc jockey there, and he looks like he's just barely out of high school or college, possibly. So with ABC added to the lineup, we have the big three: ABC, NBC, and CBS, and their logos there. The I, that's an I there from CBS. NBC's logo is a peacock, and that's because RCA got very heavy when television came along. They started pushing their color televisions in the 1950s, and so they thought that wonderful, colorful peacock would be a good logo for them. So that's what that is. It's a little hard to tell. In the earlier days, it was sort of animated. You could tell, but there's like the beak and so on, and that's a peacock. And their new streaming service, their new video, television, whatever streaming service is going to be called Peacock. A lot of people aren't sure that's the best name, but anyway, that's what they're going to call it. The NBC Universal streaming service will be called Peacock. In the 1920s, electronic microphones came in, and they had a big impact on film and radio and music recording. So it was a big thing. Music changed. You used to be able to sing kind of into like a if you curl up a piece of paper and talk through it, it sounds a little bit like that. Okay, and that's the way you could record on music onto records. It wasn't electronic, right? Early records that Edison invented way back in the 1870s were not electronic, right? It was kind of a mechanical medium. So until the 1920s, recording was done one way. Movies, of course, weren't talkies, right? We've already talked about that. Talkies came in 1927, and then on radio. Okay, so electronic microphones. That was kind of a big thing. Early radio talent often comes from vaudeville. And vaudeville is a live variety show, entertainment, singing, comedy, animals. Now, I don't know that the animals and the juggling would work very well for radio. It doesn't make any sense. But then one of the biggest radio acts was a ventriloquist act. So it doesn't seem, very logical. A big part of ventriloquism is that you don't see somebody's the ventriloquist's lips moving while the dummy is talking. But I don't know. And this guy looks like a ventriloquist dummy. I don't know what he's doing up there, but that's like kind of a ventriloquist dummy. And again, that would work okay on stage in vaudeville, but not very well. I wouldn't think on the radio. But yeah, there was actually ventriloquism on the radio. It's the strangest thing. So people that came from vaudeville, which is like a variety show, a live variety show. And Saturday Night Live is a little bit like that, not quite, but just a little bit like that. Mostly they just do music and comedy without, the opera or the juggling or anything like that. There was a show on TV for quite a while called The Ed Sullivan Show, and that's the famous show that the Beatles first starred on when they came to America. And if you've ever seen any of those old Beatle clips of them on the Ed Sullivan Show, that was kind of like a live vaudeville type show, a live variety show. And they had jugglers and magicians and comedians and all of that on television. Variety shows have always been a big thing on TV, but not so much anymore. The closest thing we have really to variety on TV anymore would be singing competitions, but not too much. And some dancing, I guess there's some dancing, and America's Got Talent. There's a little bit of that, so it's kind of still there. It's kind of in television's DNA with talent shows and talent competitions and all that. Anyway, so Act Two, vaudeville, and a number of stars. These aren't the only two, but a number of stars. Bing Crosby there on the left and Bob Hope were vaudeville stars. They became radio stars, had radio programs. They became movie stars and TV stars. So they kind of saw out all of the entertainment through most of the 20th century. If they had lived a little longer, they would have been probably some kind of internet star, something like that. Bob Hope lived to be 100 or 101, so he lived to see the computer internet age. Anyway, there they are, and they were, like I say, they made some movies together and so on. Here's Jack Benny, another vaudeville radio star, TV star, kind of a movie star, and so on too, and kind of a backstage look there with the big microphone, look like they're in the middle of a show. golden age of network radio was the 30s and the 40s, about 20 years or so. And by the end of the 40s, television started appearing. 1949 and 50, 51, 52, television really started taking off. Not too many people had radios before 1930. A few in 27, 28, 29, a few had radios, but radio really took off really in the 30s and 40s. And the schedule was a lot like today's TV schedule. And if you do lots of streaming, you're probably a little unfamiliar with the way a TV schedule works. But from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and well, even today, but the audience has really dropped off. You would get soap operas in the afternoon, the thought being that women would be at home, housewives would be at home cleaning the house, and they could listen to their favorite soap operas. They were called soap operas because they sold products, advertisers sold products directly to women, and a lot of it would be about cleaning and that sort of thing, right? So women are home, and here's a new detergent to get your clothes cleaner or get your floors spotless, all that kind of stuff. So somebody dubbed them soap operas, and the name stuck. So soaps would be on in the afternoon, and then when the kids came home from school at 3 or 3:30, something like that, then there would be after-school shows for the kids, maybe The Adventures of Superman, maybe The Lone Ranger, or Little Orphan Annie, kids-type shows, and then comedy, a little bit of news, not that much news, really, until World War II broke out, but comedy in the early evening, and just like today, if you were to watch Modern Family, or a few years ago Friends or Seinfeld, then they were on 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, something like that, pretty early in the evening. And then drama would be on later in the evening at 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening after dinner. And that's where all of the NCIS type shows and the cop shows and Hawaii Five-0 and all the dramas would normally be a little later, stuff not especially for kids. And kids should be in bed by 9 or 10, something like that. So that's the way radio was, and then that's the way television became. So television really, and I will say this a couple of times, was radio with pictures. It really was radio with pictures. And so the programming schedule, the length of the programs, advertising in the middle of the programs, all that stuff, it all originated with radio. And you might be wondering, hey, what happened to the movies and all that? And they just didn't really see the need to get into radio. They didn't buy radio stations for the most part or anything like that. And really a missed opportunity, you have to say. That the whole mass medium and everything. It seems like a perfect fit for movies and the movie studios. And as we know today, fast forward to 2020s, they're all parts of big giant conglomerates. NBC and Universal are together. Universal being a big movie studio, and CBS and Paramount, and ABC and Disney, a very big conglomerate, as we know. So it seemed like a natural fit. It turns out it was a natural fit, but they sure didn't see it at that time. There's a nice radio. Pictures of a couple of nice radios. They're nice hardwood, mahogany, that sort of thing. And the bigger the radio, the nicer of a speaker you could have. And it really could be almost like a piece of furniture. Something like this would sit on the floor, and pretty big speakers here, and you could get a pretty nice sound. And no remote, so somebody would usually, when you see pictures, somebody is sitting within arm's reach of the dial, so that they could change the dial. Here's an elaborate radio. It looks like you can have presets. Just like in cars, looks like you could have presets on your radio and just punch the button for the NBC Blue or CBS or something like that. So in the middle of this era of network radio, and today network radio is not such a big thing. Of course, we still have lots of radio, but the network radio isn't such a big thing. But back in 1938, it sure was, right at the peak. And this young kid, really 22, came to New York City, and he was doing Broadway type shows. He was doing radio shows, and eventually, the War of the Worlds made him fairly famous, and he got a film contract and went off to Hollywood to make Citizen Kane. But he did this program, The Night That Panicked America. There's a really good documentary that you can listen to on YouTube. So follow that link and listen to the documentary. I think it's 30 or 40 minutes, and it's quite good, and it's quite famous or infamous because it really did panic a lot of people. It really did panic an awful lot of people. He structured it as you'll hear in the documentary. I don't want to overdo it because you'll hear it in the documentary. But I do have some nice pictures from the 1953 film version, not the Steven Spielberg, Tom Cruise version of it later in the 2000s, I guess 2002 or 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. But from the 1952 or 53 film version, and so it was in color. Not all sci-fi films were in color. A lot of them were sort of low budget and cheap and all that, and destined for the drive-in. And we get the Martian probe or something coming out of the capsule. It kind of looks like a meteorite and so on because it's all crusted with, I don't know, fire, all that good kind of stuff. We don't really see them much in the movie, but they did make some Martians for the film, which is kind of cool, right? Nice design. I really like that design. And we see the waving of the white flag, and we're friends and all that, and then of course they all get blasted. Now in the radio broadcast of it, that's pretty scary because you're going to hear the radio reporter, and it's blasting, and people are practically screaming into the mic, and it's about 20 yards away, and it's coming this way now. And then he's quiet for a little while, right? He's quiet because he got it. He got hit, right? Our poor radio broadcaster. So if you want to, the whole War of the Worlds radio broadcast is online too. It's like 50 some minutes or so. You don't have to listen to the whole thing. If you're going to listen to that, I would say the first attack appears somewhere around 19 minutes in, and it's presented as a series of news bulletins. Here's another picture of these very cool spaceships. Now, in the book, they walk around sort of on 3 legs, sort of tripod legs, and Spielberg did that in his film. But I love this design. This is a very cool design of these spaceships, sort of like a manta ray. It's very cool. And there they are over the landscape. So, like I said, it was presented. If you're not paying attention, and the documentary will make this plain, if you didn't hear the beginning of the broadcast, then you might be confused and think that it's just a musical program with interruptions from the news bureaus reporting on mysterious meteorites landing in Grover's Mill, and so on. The book by H.G. Wells, and they don't spell their name quite the same way. Orson has an E after his name, W-E-L-L-E-S. H.G. Wells, so they're not related, but H.G. Wells wrote the book along with The Invisible Man and some other good stuff, The Time Machine. He set his naturally right near London, because that's where he was writing in 1897 or 1898 or 1899, something like that. The Martians land outside of London and terrorize the English countryside. In the radio broadcast from Orson Welles, they land in New Jersey, just across the river from New York, So Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and they set up their tripods and they cause terror and they go heading into New York City. The 1953 film version, they land in Pomona. They land in Pomona, right there in the San Gabriel Valley, and which is kind of interesting. It's not very far away, and then they head into Los Angeles, and they end up in downtown LA, and so on. So each version they sort of switch, where they are. And the Steven Spielberg Tom Cruise version seems like they're back on the East Coast again. Maybe it's New Jersey or something. It seems like they're back on the East Coast again. So it really did cause panic, and as you'll see in the documentary, Orson Welles was told right in the middle of the broadcast that people are calling into the radio station. They're calling in, they're confused, they're angry, they're scared, they don't know what's going on. And he says, they're scared? Good. They're supposed to be. The broadcast was October 30th, just the night before Halloween, but it was their Sunday night broadcast. And so it was just kind of a ghost story, right? It's just a scary thing for Halloween for his radio program, Mercury Theater on the Air. So the newsreel people came to the CBS building, and he appears in a newsreel, which you will see, and he denies everything. I had no idea that I was causing panic or anything like that. And the people that were there, the actors and the producers, later on, they have said, "Oh yeah, everybody knew, right? That William S. Paley came in. He was like in his bathrobe, and said, what's going on and everything." And they wouldn't make any more announcements. They wouldn't make any announcements. They might have finally made an announcement way deep into the night, into the show. It was like an hour-long broadcast. They're pretty deep in, but they didn't make any announcements or anything like that for that most people would hear. And so we will see a newsreel of Orson Welles. And I want to bring that up because newsreels are part of media and mass media and all that. And movie studios had news units that would go out. And there were some independent ones too, independent news units, not parts of studios. And they would go out and they would film stories just like you'd see on television news. And so in the 1930s or 1940s, if you were going to see President Roosevelt, or if you're going to see Babe Ruth, or if you're going to see even Adolf Hitler speak and so on, it wouldn't be on television because television wasn't really around yet. You aren't going to see them on radio. You can see pictures of them in magazines and newspapers, but you would see it in a movie theater. You'd see it in a movie theater. And it would take a while, right, because they'd have to film the event, and then they'd have to process it and get it to the lab and then edit it and then make copies of it to go out with films that were showing all over the country. And it would be shown at the beginning of a film, like the cartoons and stuff used to be. There always used to be a cartoon before, or almost always used to be a cartoon before movies started. And they would have, sometimes you'd see what they call coming attractions, but they're called trailers in part because they trailed the movie. They used to play at the end of a movie. Now they are coming attractions that play before the movie starts. But there would be newsreels, cartoons, sometimes documentaries, sometimes a double feature, all that kind of stuff. So this would be a good time to stop this part, go over, watch the documentary. It's pretty good. And then come back to us finishing up our radio discussion. 1930s, our president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, he used radio for, I'm not sure if he called them or somebody else, but they're called fireside chats. And jittery Americans during the Depression would do at one time, there was a run on the banks, and everybody decided they wanted to take all their money out of the banks all at once. And that's called a run on the banks. There isn't everybody's money in the banks because when people deposit money in savings accounts, then the banks lend that money back out for car loans and mortgage loans and things like that. So the money is kind of in a it's kind of cycled through, right? Saving, lending. It sort of has a cycling. So if everybody wants their money out all at once, they don't have everybody's money. It's in somebody's car loan or somebody's house loan or somebody's whatever college loan. So he went on the air. He talked to people, and he instituted a bank holiday. He closed all the banks down for a few days so that all the jittery people could sort of calm down. And so people have used. Here he is again. If there's ever a coup, a coup d'état, a military takeover, even to this day, one of the first things that the military or the leaders of the offshoot would do, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in Asia or Africa, is take over the media. Take over the media. So if there were any coups in the Middle East or Africa or wherever, they would head to the radio stations and the newspapers and tell everyone, go home, everything's fine, we're in control. And later on, television stations, that's one of the first things you do. And even today, they would go and control the internet, which is mostly wires. We get it through Wi-Fi and things like that. But there are cables and wires, and if you want to cut off Facebook, there's a wire that that's coming in that you can pull that plug, right? So if China or whatever, North Korea, right? If anybody wants to limit the media, you can find that cable that's coming in, under the ocean, all the way. They lay those cables underneath the ocean, goes all the way across the ocean, comes up from New York, comes up in England, and from there it goes on to Europe and so on. But if ever there's a takeover, even to this day, taking over the media, right? Internet, radio, TV, and newspapers. It's that important. The mass media, the news media is that important. That's one of the first places people go. 1940s, audio tape is brought to the U.S. from Germany. They had it in the 30s, in the 1930s, but we weren't on particularly good terms with the Nazis and Hitler and all of that. And so when our troops were marching and jeeping and tanking across Germany in 1945, 44, 45, at the close of World War II, they would be picking up signals and programs and propaganda. Go back, GI. You're not going to make it, and we're in control here, and we have secret weapons to kill you all. All that propaganda, and they would go to find the radio towers and things like that, and they'd find the little building, and inside those buildings, nobody would be there. And they'd find these machines, just going round and round and round. Okay, you could put on, 90 minutes or something like that on one of these reel-to-reel audio tape recorders, magnetic tape. Okay, reel-to-reel tape recorders. And so some of them, they grabbed them and sent them back here to the engineers and scientists and all that. And that's partly we got tape from Germany. Oops, that's kind of a repeat. Let's see what happens. There we go. So Bing Crosby, we talked about him a little bit before with Bob Hope, coming out of vaudeville and radio and all that. And he liked the idea of audio tape. And he liked the idea of pre-recording his radio show before the broadcast. Maybe if he thought that he didn't sing the song as nicely as he could have. And he was a pretty good singer, but I understand that he really wanted to get things just right. He was really a perfectionist. Same thing if a joke went kind of flat. He liked the idea of editing out mistakes and things like that. And so he was an early investor, a very early investor in all this. became Ampex audio tape. Later in the 1950s, they invent videotape, and later on, this magnetic tape is used for computers. Before floppy disks and hard drives and all that, there was computer tape, or magnetic. It was magnetic tape. So one of our entertainers became a big investor, and he made a lot of money off of all this too. He was very smart. He invested in this crazy. People said, "Well, we have records and we have radio, and who cares about audio tape and so on?" But he invested in all that, and it becomes videotape and computer tape and all that. He became pretty wealthy from all his investments. Pretty cagey investments. 1950, we have the rise of television, and radio is going to have to reinvent itself, because television is going to be radio with pictures. We get to see all those people. You don't have to imagine the Lone Ranger on his horse, Silver. You can tune in and see the Lone Ranger on his horse, Silver. Or you can, you don't have to imagine Superman flying, although probably if you imagine Superman flying, you are doing a better job than the 1950s Superman TV show. But anyway, the same thing goes for the situation comedies. Here's a family, a knock at the door, a doorbell rings, and you hear on radio, you'd hear the sound effect of a door opening, and come on into the kitchen and all that, right? Just like a sitcom would be, like Friends or Seinfeld, right? Only it's on the radio. And now they build those sets. So the Jack Benny show and the Bob Hope show, they all have sets now. You don't have to imagine what their living rooms and stuff look like anymore. Of course, that wasn't their real living room or office or whatever. But anyway, you could watch it on TV, right? People really like that. And so TV became radio with pictures, the same schedule, soap operas in the afternoon, kids shows later on, news, and then comedy in the early part of the evening, usually family comedy that the whole family could watch, and then dramas and things like that in the later evening. And this is before like talk shows. This is before like Johnny Carson and the Tonight Show and all that kind of stuff. But that would come in pretty soon in the 50s. The Tonight Show and so on was on, and the Today Show early in the morning, 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. So they happened, and we'll talk about that when we get into TV. Radio, now it's going to change. Okay, they don't need to be doing these big, elaborate programs with actors and writers and musicians, because there was always music, there was always a band, a small band, and sound effects people, and all of that. Right? So radio doesn't need all that. Those people are all going to go get jobs on television for the most part. Not the sound effects people so much, but they're all going to get jobs on television programs. And along with that, they're going to need costumers and set designer people, lighting people, and all of that. Right? All of the things you need for a live broadcast. And so all that big network radio. All those big network radio productions, they're going to kind of go away. There's a transition period where there's radio plays, as they would call them, the radio programs, and television, but a lot of people didn't see the point. A lot of Americans had televisions by 1953 or 1954. Maybe a third of the country had a television by about 54, and probably 2/3 of the country had televisions by 57 or 58. So not quite 100% of the country, but it would get up to 100% or whatever, 98% by the early 1960s. It grew pretty fast in just a 10-year period, really, from like 0 to 90 in maybe 10 years. So radio started playing more music. Disc jockeys, there's a nice young disc jockey right there. Radio starts playing lots and lots of music. It's a lot cheaper to have a stack of records and an engineer and maybe an announcer for the news or weather or traffic or something like that. Just 2 or 3 people that can work at a radio station. and the what they had to do is they had to sort of work out a deal with the musicians and musicians unions, because in the 30s, records weren't of the highest quality, but still musicians figured out if they're just going to play our records, then we're going to be out of work. We should probably, they're thinking, never record our music, because they'll just take our recordings and we will never get hired, right? We'll never have work. So there was a thought, in the musicians and so on, that we don't want the radio people to get a hold of our recorded music. And they had unions and all that stuff, and they finally worked out a deal, and the technology got better so that the radios, the records sounded better and so on than they did in the early 30s. And so now with residuals, that's kind of a key there. Now that they could have residuals, every time a record was played, the composer gets maybe 1 or 2 pennies, 1 or 2 cents, but still, thousands of times that money does add up. And so that and radio programs moving basically to television. We have the rise of the DJ, fall of the networks. I mean, they're still kind of around, but they're not the big thing they were. And then local radio stations really become the thing. So eventually, even in the 1950s, there were different types of music, classical music and what they used to call country and western music, hillbilly music actually, then country and western music, and popular music. And then by the mid to late 50s, we start getting rock music. And so all of that starts separating, right? Instead of hearing everything on one station, now you can hear one station that's going to specialize in popular music, another station is going to specialize in country and western, as was called, or classical music, or jazz, or whatever. And those are all called formats. This is a much more modern setup with online, could be streaming. Not sure what's going on here, but I'm sure there's a digital and streaming and all that is involved. Okay, but radio types are formats. Now, radio advertising is based on day parts, not on programs, because today you might have the same DJ or the same 2 DJs on the air for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 hours, right? 3 or 4 or 5 hours, something like that. So instead of programs, and remember, most television programs are 30 minutes and 60 minutes, and so on. But radio, it's by day part. There's kind of a little bit of a graph throughout the day. The big one is AM drive, somewhere around 5 or 5:30 to 9:30 or 10 a.m. That's radio's biggest audience, thus the highest ad rates. Okay, so that'd be the highest ad rate. So we get AM drive, a little bit of a spike in the middle of the day around lunchtime, and then driving home, and so on. Okay, the 3 parts of the day. So those are the day parts. This is really an odd thing. I have a little trouble. Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 12. Monday through Friday, 12 to 3. Right, sort of drops off and so on. Anyway, those are by day parts, and that's radio's biggest audience. Now, television, biggest audience is going to be after dinner, prime time in the evening. Okay, and we'll talk about that. But I think a lot of people, even if you're streaming, even if you're on Netflix, probably a lot of that is going to happen, or Disney Plus, or Hulu, or whatever, or just watching network TV, watching Modern Family or something like that, or NCIS. That's going to be after dinner, right? After dinner, and the dishes are done, and maybe the homework is done, then everybody's going to start watching TV, and that's prime time. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, we get the rise of FM radio. It had been invented in the late 40s, but it wasn't used very much. It was often simulcast, the same records and the same program going out over the AM and FM. But at a certain point, the FCC said, no more simulcasting. You need a whole different program. And that was good news for for DJs, now you have to hire more engineers, you have to hire DJs, and all of that. A whole nother set. You can't just duplicate the whole thing from AM to FM. So when that happened, and then with early rock music, sort of transitioning from the early rock, Elvis, and the early Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and then in the late '60s we get symphonic works like Sgt. Pepper, Day in the Life, stuff like that, Tommy's rock opera, and so on, and a lot of that rock music, prog rock, progressive rock, Genesis, stuff like that, and Pink Floyd, right? Really sonically driven rock music. It sounds much better in stereo, so much better in stereo. It's not just a couple of guitars and a drummer. And so FM radio really takes off in the late 60s, 68, 69, 70. Sometimes they call it album-oriented rock, so they play like the whole album instead of just playing a single. Then they might say, well, we're going to listen to the whole Sgt. Pepper, the whole rock opera of Tommy by The Who, or something like that. So FM radio really took off. Now, an interesting side point about all this is you can kind of trace radio and music by what is put in cars. And, in the early days, of course, in the 20s and 30s, cars didn't come with much of anything, but high-end cars, Cadillacs, whatever, Lincolns, maybe they would start coming with a radio already in the car, right? High-end cars. Today would be, maybe Mercedes and BMWs and Lexus and stuff like that. And so then, Fords and Chevys and stuff would start putting radios in the cars, and then FM radio coming in, so FM started being AM, FM in your car, pre-installed. You didn't have to go buy one and put it in. And then cassette tapes would be automatically installed, or possibly 8-track tapes would be already installed in your car. There was a pretty good business for a lot of people, tech people, that could go to, it wasn't Best Buy back then, but it was like a Best Buy, big electronic stores and stuff, and you could buy a cassette player or a CD player for your car and have it installed, and while you're at it, you could have it put in some nice big speakers, maybe back there by your back window or in your doors and things like that. And so the whole idea of car installations, electronic car installations for not just AM, FM radio, which a lot of cars would have by that point in the 70s, say, and 80s, but with 8-track and cassette tape, and then finally CDs. And so that whole aftermarket installation became kind of a big thing. Today we have satellite radio. That's the latest of radio, and you can get with commercials or commercial free. Of course, you're going to have to pay a little bit more money with commercial free, depending what you're going to do. But this would be the Sirius XM. So internet streaming, satellite and streaming, I guess, are kind of the newest. So commercial or subscription. Here's somebody streaming. I can't tell what. Over their smartphone. I don't even call them smartphones anymore. It seems like all phones are pretty smart. So just over the phone. Okay, so that's the latest radio technology, podcasting. Certainly, and all of that, and streaming. But that pretty much brings us up. Mostly the beginning part of radio, that network radio, that's kind of the interesting part for the whole family sitting around in the living room and listening to broadcasts of War of the Worlds or whatnot. And that's kind of what happened to television, and then cable, and now we all kind of go off on our own way if we're streaming or something like that. But it used to be kind of a family a family activity. So we do have some kind of continuing themes in media, and we're going to pick up on this when we get into recorded music and when we get into computing and a few other things that really the inventors don't know what is going to happen with their invention. The radio people are thinking ship to shore, and the phonograph people are thinking something else, and the internet people are thinking something else. So inventors don't tend to know what's going to happen. Those are the entrepreneurs, a whole different thing, are entrepreneurs. The established industry isn't really a big fan of change. The movie people didn't really get radio or TV. The TV people didn't really get cable TV and streaming. The radio people didn't really get files and file sharing, and the music people, popular music people, they didn't really get files and file sharing. They didn't, all these new technologies, and they're really what they call disruptive, really disruptive. Anytime there's a new technology, whether it's talking, motion pictures, color, widescreen, television, radio, all that stuff, all these new technologies, and we're not done. We're not done. A lot of stuff is going to change in your lifetimes as well. Newspapers, right? People don't read papers so much anymore. They read news, streaming their news, right, on their news feeds, all that kind of stuff. So industry change is always problematic. Change is always problematic and disruptive for established industries. And finally, media consolidation is also going to be a big part of all this stuff. Companies are going to get bought and gobbled up. Sirius used to be one, and XM used to be another, and then they got combined. NBC and Universal, and CBS and Paramount and Disney with Marvel and Lucas and all that stuff. So all these giant conglomerates are consolidating all of the media. Okay, so I hope that worked for you. That's as close as I can get to an actual in-the-class lecture. And there's that really good War of the Worlds documentary that I'd like you to listen to. It's quite entertaining. It's hosted by James Cameron from a little while ago. He looks kind of young, 10, 15, 20 years ago. James Cameron hosting a wonderful documentary on Orson Welles and War of the Worlds. So make sure you listen to that, and we'll see you next time.